Hey guys, so last time I put together a Druid video, it got a lot of positive feedback, so I figured that you may enjoy another video on the Druid. First, I'll be going over some descriptions of what a Druid is from the D&D wiki, and I'll also very briefly go over what roles the Druid is going to fit into in both solos and trios. After that's all done, I'm going to finish by breaking down all the concept art that I put together for the Druid class. This will include 4 unique passives, actives, and spells. All information that's gathered for this video can be found on the D&D community wiki, fully accessible online. I'll have the link in the description below if you want to check it out for yourself. First, let's start with answering the question, what is a Druid? Here are a few of the descriptions that I was able to find, which I think are most appropriate. Holding a gnarled staff wreathed with holly, an elf summons the fury of the storm and calls down explosive bolts of lightning to smite the torch-carrying orcs who threaten her forest. And here are a couple other sentences that help describe what the Druid is and how you may expect it to appear in Dark and Darker. Swinging a blade formed of pure fire, crouching out of sight on a high tree branch in the form of a leopard. Druids are an embodiment of nature's resilience, cunning, and fury. They claim no mastery over nature. Instead, they see themselves as extensions of nature's indomitable will. Druid spells are oriented toward nature and animals, the power of tooth and claw, of sun and moon, of fire and storm. From these descriptions, we can assume that the Druid is a powerful class which uses the magical elements of nature itself to dispose of its enemies. I'd also like to take the time to point out that Druids can take on the form of different animals that it's seen in nature. Now, I should point out that the developers at Iron Mace have mentioned that the Druid class will be using Earth element magic spells. Currently, the only earth elemental magic spell in the game is the cleric's earthquake. But listening to these descriptions for the Druid has led me to believe that the Druid is going to be capable of harnessing more elemental magic than just earth. Expect to see the Druid harnessing elemental magics such as arcane, lightning, and fire alongside earth magic and healing spells. Now I'm going to show you an image. This is the picture that I used to represent the classic Druid from my first Druid video. Although this does get the point across, I felt that it could too easily be confused with a wizard. And so I wanted to find a better representation for the Druid. Thanks to a very talented artist on Reddit, I was able to find this. Now this seems much more appropriate when describing our Druid. A long flowing cape ever present in Dark and Darker, a tall and gnarled wooden staff, an assortment of leathers and cloths outfitting her armor, but most importantly, wielding fire in the palm of her hand. Next up on the agenda is, what role will the Druid fulfill when it comes to Dark and Darker? Fortunately for us, this question has actually been answered by the developers. In one of the podcasts, the developers clearly stated that the vision for the Druid is to be a hybrid support class. The devs went on to clarify that they want the Druid to be able to provide support and healing to its allies, and at times be able to lead the charge and kind of be the support at the front lines. And this is the point in the video where I have to reiterate that Druids are not only known as support classes in D&D. They are also known to be able to smite their enemies with lightning bolts out of the sky and conjure pixie fire in their hands and burn their enemies to a crisp. Druids are more than capable magical sorcerers who are able to fight their enemies. And we know that the devs need to make every class a viable option within the solos as well as the trios. So I definitely expect to see the Druid having many offensive capabilities through the use of their spells and buffs. And this is great news for any of you guys who like the Warlock or Wizard classes. So to summarize what I'm saying, in solo matchmaking, I expect that we will be seeing Druids fulfilling a role that is going to be reminiscent of a hybrid between the Cleric and a Wizard. Now, obviously, this sounds absolutely terrifying, but allow me to clarify that I don't think we'll be seeing a 70% PDR Druid healing and buffballing itself while slinging fireballs and slamming lightning down on you. I expect there to be a happy medium where the Druid is going to be less tanky than the Clerics, and their magical damage output is going to be much less than that of a Wizard. And as far as trios go, I expect that you're going to be able to inject a Druid into just about any 3-man comp, kind of like how you can always find space to have a Cleric or a Bard on your team. And depending on what types of buffs or heals that the Druid is going to be able to provide its team, we may actually see a downshift in the amount of Bards or Clerics in 3-man comps if the Druid is strong enough. And now's a pretty good time to mention that I don't believe the Druid is going to be capable of wearing heavier armors like plate legs or fine cuirasses. I actually found this information on the D&D wiki, which very clearly states Druids will not wear armor or use shields made of metal. It also says that their weapons include clubs, daggers, maces, and quarterstaves, which are all weapons that have already been brought into Dark and Darker. So to summarize what we've talked about, the Druid should be able to take part in some melee combat, but I expect it to be pretty bare bones, especially in the beginning. The fun stuff is mostly going to be on the magical side with their spells. I expect Druids to be able to both buff and heal their allies with their magic. And I also expect Druids to have offensive spell capabilities, not nearly as fleshed out as, say, a Wizard, but I expect them to have more or just around the same amount of offensive spells as a Warlock would. And then the really fun stuff about the Druid is going to take place with their transformations. And we're going to talk about those animal forms here in a minute. Personally, I've been waiting for this Druid to come to Dark and Darker since it was first mentioned in playtest 4, or maybe it was 5. And ever since I heard about it, I thought, you know what? That definitely sounds like the class for me. Now that we've gotten some of that stuff out of the way, I think it is time for the fun stuff. First, just a quick warning. What I'm about to show you isn't going to be super pretty, but I think it is enough to give you a really good idea of what I believe the Druid is going to be, what some of my expectations for it are, and hopefully the images and the explanations that I give you are enough to kind of convince you that yes, this does feel right for a Druid. Okay, with that being said, let's do it. Now, as you can see, here is the illustration that I put together with all the different concept art all stapled to one page, and we're going to break down every single piece bit by bit. I know there's a lot going on, but before that, let me explain two things. The first thing is, when I was doing my research for the Druid, there's so much information to gather, and it was only feasible that if I want to put it all together in a video, I'm going to have to limit how much information I try to condense. And so, after a little bit of thought, I came to the conclusion that 4 per category was going to be more than enough to kind of get the Druid feeling alive. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was when I decided to come up with 4 abilities per category, I decided that I would make one ability that's very much so rooted in the idea of what a Druid is, and I think that one of each of these abilities almost certainly will find its way into Dark and Darker. I then decided I would do the complete opposite with another ability. There was no considerations for balance or how it would affect other classes, OP level, or any of that stuff. Just pure fun. And then the other 2 abilities per category, just kind of somewhere in the middle. They probably will be, or they probably won't be. Who knows? Mostly just fun. And a final note is to just keep in mind that everything that I'm about to go over are all spells that are used by the Druid in Dungeons and Dragons. None of these spells are made up by me or anybody else. These have already been very well established. I am simply a messenger. For our first and most likely passive, we have Barkskin. The Druid's presence alone gives all allies a flat +20 physical and magic resistance bonus. And next, we have Protection from Poison. A strong immunity makes negative status effects suffer from 25% potency and duration. Followed by Wild Cunning. The Druid's mastery of terrain give it a 10% movement speed bonus when in animal form. And our last and least likely is Dark Vision. The sharp vision of a hawk cannot be fooled. The Druid can see invisible enemies when they move. Now that we know what the passives are, let's go ahead and talk about them a little bit. So, the reason that I went with Barkskin was because this spell in Dungeons and Dragons is a pretty early on spell that the Druid can use to help protect either themselves or their allies by coating them in a tree-like exoskeleton. And the reason that I wanted this to translate into a passive was because of 2 reasons. First of all, thematically, it fits with the Earth-style magic. But secondly, the Druid, as we know, is going to be a support hybrid style of character. So being able to have an aura which helps elevate yourself and your teammates just really seems to fit the Druid playstyle. And it's worth noting that I took a lot of my inspiration for this from the Cleric's Holy Aura as well as the Rogue's Jokester perk. Overall, I definitely anticipate having a perk just like this for the Druid. It may not end up being the exact same, but if it does, you saw it here first. Moving on, we have Protection from Poison. So the reason that I decided to go with more survivability in the passive was, again, because the Druid is supposed to be a support character, but there's a second point that I kind of wanted to harp on. I really don't think, like I mentioned before, that the Druid is going to be able to wear heavier plate armor and things like that because thematically it just doesn't fit. Another thing to note is that although it's called Protection from Poison, currently, as far as it stands, Dark and Darker doesn't have a lot of poison damage. There is like the Centipede and the Goblin Caves as well as Rogues, but I just don't think that that's enough to give the Druid a single hard counter towards 2 very specific types of enemies. So I decided to go with a more holistic type of utility. And you may have noticed that this passive is basically the same as the Cleric's Protection from Evil. And there's actually a good reason for that. In Dungeons and Dragons, the Druid has an ability which is called Protection from Evil and Good. So the Protection from Evil is not only limited to a cleric, it's something that the cleric and druid both share. All right, on to the next. We have Wild Cunning. In the D&D wiki, Wild Cunning is a spell that the druid can use to try to find food, clean drinking water, or a suitable shelter for you and your companions. So the way that I envisioned this perk translating into Dark and Darker was a way for the druid to kind of lead the pack, lead the charge for your allies. And when I think about the druid leading the pack, I just naturally think of them being in front of their other two party members. So that's what kind of led me to a movement speed bonus while they were shapeshifting. Overall, I don't think that this specific passive would be totally out of the question, but it may not ever see any type of rendition within the game just because of how specific I made it. But I still think it would be kind of cool, and it's totally fitting. And now let's move on to the final passive. This passive is probably very unlikely to ever find its way into Dark and Darker, and I definitely took some creative leaps and bounds with this one. In D&D, Dark Vision is a spell that the druid can cast in order to grant anybody the ability to see in the dark. And in Dungeons and Dragons, the range for Dark Vision is like 60 feet out in front of you. Now, there's a very obvious problem here. Dark and Darker is, well, a very dark game. And darkness is kind of one of the elements that the developers at Iron Mace want you to play into. And I just felt that it was completely breaking the mold. And it totally went against what Dark and Darker really is as a game. But I also remembered how so many people within the community wanted changes to invisibility. Many people were asking to just have more viable counters for invisibility. And as it stands so far, there really isn't a good way to counter a player who's abusing invisibility. You just kind of have to know that they are there, or you have to absolutely stat check them so that they don't just come out of invis and instantly kill you. In recent patches, the invisibility from the wizard has been touched on, and it's been nerfed in some other ways, but one of the biggest changes to it has been the addition of an after image to anybody who has the invisibility buff on them. Now, when a player has a wizard's invisibility buff cast upon them, they flash on the screen every second or so in order to help other players be able to track where the player is. And really, that's where the inspiration for Dark Vision in D&D's adaptation came from. Now let's talk about our active skills. First, I think we should just get spell memory out of the way. We know that the druid is going to have spell memory because any character in Dark and Darker that wants to cast spells needs to have spell memory equipped in order to, well, cast. So yeah, there's really not much to go into here. Now let's zoom out a bit and take a look at these three skills on the left side. From top to bottom, we have Wild Shape Bear Form, followed by Spider Form, and lastly, we have Rat Form. Now, the only one that's actually been confirmed is the Bear Form at the very top, but we did hear the developers talking about different ideas that they had, which included turning into a spider and spitting poison at people, or turning into a rat and scurrying underneath doors to escape from enemies. These are all really cool ideas, but I do believe that these are a little bit more of a stretch, the bottom two anyways, and that it's much more likely when we get multiple forms for the druid that we're going to see a four-legged agile creature like a leopard or a wolf form. And I think that we're also going to be very likely to get a more evasive form, which could come in the shape of an eagle or a hawk. Now, one thing that we have to talk about is with the release of the Warlock Demon form, we now know that transformations are going to be skills and not spells like we originally anticipated. And because of that, now we have to ask the question of whether or not the druid is going to be able to transform into more than 2 different animals per raid, Or are they just going to be hard locked into having to decide whether they want to take in spells and one animal form or two animal forms max? And my solution is to create a new skill which would look very similar to the spell memory at the bottom right, but instead it's going to be exclusive to the Druid and their transformations. So you would have this skill selected and you would hold down your E or Q button and a wheel would pop up just like how it does currently for spells. But instead you would be selecting which animal you want to shape shift into, and then you could hold right click to commit to the transformation or something along those lines. I'm not sure what route Iron Mace intends to take, but I really hope that it's not going to be just as simple as the Druid only being able to pick one animal form, because I feel like that takes a lot away from the Druid class. The whole idea is to be able to turn into animals, and that's kind of what I want to see. I want to jump into a raid and just see a bunch of bears, spiders, and wolves running around all crazy. And now we get on to my personal favorite, Wall of Thorns. In D&D, a druid can cast a spell called Wall of Thorns to conjure up a wall that's 60 feet long, 10 feet high, and 5 feet thick. They can also conjure this wall to be a circle that either surrounds themselves or an enemy. Now, I've had an idea for this to be an ability for a druid literally the first day that I heard about druids coming to Dark and Darker, and this was like in playtest 4. In my head, what I always envisioned was you're running away from a team because they're gonna get you and take all your loot, and the druid turns around in one of those tight hallways inside of the crypts and can cast this spell or skill where they summon up this wall of vines that erupt from the ground, and basically they create a temporary wall that is maybe impassable or impenetrable. Now, as I went ahead and started refining it so it could fit a little more into Dark and Darker, I decided that Wall of Thorns would have to be waited out for 15 seconds or something like that, or you could beat it with, your sword or axes, but it would take something like a two-handed axe from a barbarian, or you could even maybe light it on fire with your torch to try to remove it more quickly in order to pursue your chase. Overall, I think this would be such a banger of a skill to bring into the game, but I'm also kind of biased because I am a pretty huge Naruto fan, and I just want to have wood release in Dark and Darker. I guess another comparison could be something like Sage's Ice Wall from Valorant. And overall, I just really like the idea of having an ability like this where it's purely based around utility and preventing certain classes from chasing you. This sounded really good to me, especially during that whole barbarian meta where it was just barbarians activating rage and getting like 60 movement speed and just chasing you down. It just seemed like it would have been really cool during that time. But I definitely think that this is the most creative out of all of them, and because of that, unfortunately, probably very unlikely that we'll end up seeing something like this. And that wraps up all of our skills, so let's go ahead and get to the spells. The first spell I want to focus on is at the top right. It is called Aura of Vitality. This is going to be one of the Druid's healing spells, and I'm fairly confident that the Druid is going to definitely get a healing spell. I know that for sure. For Aura of Vitality, healing energy radiates from you in an aura with a 30-foot radius, and until the spell ends, the aura moves with you centered on you. Now, I think this one translates pretty perfectly from its description in Dungeons & Dragons straight to Dark and Darker. I'm pretty certain that we're going to end up getting a spell that's very similar to this. Next, let's talk about the spell in the bottom right. This spell is called Entangle. Grasping weeds and vines sprout from the ground in a 20-foot square starting from a point within range. For the duration, these plants turn the ground in the area into difficult terrain. My vision for this spell would be very similar to a root when it comes to Dark and Darker. I could see the Druid obviously being a utility monster and being able to cast spells like roots, so pretty similar to the Cleric Bind. The main difference is going to be that when the enemy is bound by the vines, instead of playing around with the vines themselves in a minigame fashion, the enemy will either have to use an axe of some sort to cut away at the vines, or they're just going to have to endure the entire duration of the root, which maybe could be 3 seconds or something like that. Overall, I think that this spell could be very easy to implement. It fits the theme, and I definitely think that this is one of the contenders for the spells that may be what comes out with the Druid. Now, moving on, let's go to the top left spell. Now, this is where we start getting more into the creativity side. And keep in mind, I truly do expect that the Druid is going to be able to use multiple elemental magics throughout its duration in Dark and Darker. And it's not only going to be limited to using healing spells or earth style magic. This spell is called Sunbeam. The D&D wiki describes it as a beam of light which flashes out from your hand in a 60-foot line. Those hit take radiant damage and are blinded. That description fits perfectly for what I envision the spell to be. My brain immediately pictured a warlock casting Ray of Darkness, but the Druid would be casting a fiery beam version of that. So my idea for Sunbeam is that the Druid channels a spell similarly to a warlock Ray of Darkness, and as they're channeling it, they can move around, very slowly and continue attacking the target, and as they do it, every target that's hit is blinded. As far as the blind goes, I am basically picturing almost the exact same thing that happens when the Wisp on Ruins cast a blind. Your character completely loses all vision, everything turns white. It's a huge flashbang, it's very disorienting, but it doesn't last very long, and it pretty much goes away right away. In terms of damage, I think that the Sunbeam damage should actually be on the lower end, because not only is it going to be blinding enemies, maybe you can even reapply the blind during the same cast to the same enemy, and you're also going to be benefiting from the burn status, which should tick the enemy for damage over time. You could also lean even more heavily into the utility side of this spell because it'll be such low damage, and you can make it so that the beam is so hot it burns the metal on the enemy and makes it so that it reduces their physical damage reduction. Overall, I think that Sunbeam is probably about a 50-50. The developers could probably see this, and if they never thought of the idea, they might just be like, yeah, sounds good, because I think thematically it fits perfectly. And lastly, we have my favorite spell of them all, Whirlwind. Now, Whirlwind is a pretty cool spell in D&D, and I'll read you a couple pieces of it from the wiki. A whirlwind howls down to a point on the ground that you specify. The whirlwind is a 10-foot radius, 30-foot high cylinder. Until the spell ends, you can use your action to move the whirlwind up to 30 feet in any direction along the ground. Creatures caught in the whirlwind take bludgeoning damage. Now, Whirlwind in terms of Dark and Darker would first off be an arcane spell, and you guessed it, I'm going to lean into utility. And my whole idea for it would be that after a long channel, you generate a whirlwind at a point, and it starts tracking nearby enemies. The whirlwind itself would do damage in a large radius, very small damage over time. But the major utility item would be that these arcane winds are magically stripping all enemies of their buffs one by one. Now, this is definitely the spell that I took the most creative liberty with. What I was envisioning was this massive ball of magic is spinning at such high speeds that the air around it is being accelerated, and they're practically tiny little blades that are flying around and just cutting any of the enemies that fall into its path. But because the wind itself is made of the arcane magic, the other portion, which again leans into the utility of the druid, would it be that the wind is actually stripping enemies of all their buffs one at a time and kind of just sucking the life force out of them. I don't know. I might have gone a little bit overboard with this one, but I would absolutely freak out if I saw a whirlwind spell in Dark and Darker. I mean, how awesome would it be if clerics can cause an earthquake? Then let my druid create a whirlwind. And that's the last one. There it is. That is my interpretation of the druid class. I am so excited to have our hands on it here in about another week or so. And I can only hope that you had as much fun watching this video as I did making it. If you did enjoy the content that you watched today, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and absolutely comment down in the comment section what you thought. Let me know if there were any ideas that you had along the way while watching that you wanted to share. And yeah, if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.